Go ahead.
Joshua, what is the status on just war, and it's how is this? Thanks. And how is this moving at this particular time? In other words, where are we in the larger picture of just war and hopefully its demise?
I think everything rests in Judy's hands.
I'm working on it.
I think I know there was a push for the Pope to write an encyclical on the issue or some sort of document. I think the World Message for Peace in, was it January 2017, was quite notable because it was the first time a Pope had spoken about Catholic nonviolence in such a direct way. I don't know where it's going now. I've spoken to Cardinal Turkson about it a few times. It seems that there's many different ideas for what the Pope should write about, and I don't know at this point if it's on the front burner or not, but I don't know.
Bobby and Katie will get the questions.
Oh. Maybe Josh, while they're collecting the cards, I'm over here to your right. Maybe you could give us just a little bit of color, a little texture about your experience of working with Francis. So we hear that he comes and talks to you on the flights. So just tell us a little bit more about the human that's behind the structure and all of these decrees.
You are very generous to say I work with the Pope. I work around the Pope. He's very genuine in person, so I've had the opportunity to travel with him on every papal trip since January 2015. He's very genuine. He takes time with each person he meets, so when we travel with him, we're in the back of the plane, and the tradition is that the way to the country we're going to, he comes back to greet us, to shake our hands, and often he jokes with us. The big thing right now is he spends time with everyone, and at the beginning of the papacy, people like to give him like crayon drawings that their kids had done, and he loved it. And then now the big thing is for people to take out their phone and force him to put in an earbud, and their kids are like saying a message to the Pope. It's cute. It's a bit. The Vatican doesn't like it because it takes time, but I think he enjoys it. He's very cunning. We have these press conferences with him. And he's very cunning in how he answers sometimes. I don't think he's ever untruthful, but he doesn't always answer the question directly. So the best example of that would probably be when in mid-2015 he went to 3 countries in Africa, and it's an unwritten rule that when the Pope goes to Africa on the way home he gets asked about condoms and why the church isn't changing its teachings. And he obviously knew he was going to be asked that question, and he very shockingly told to the journalist his question was too small. And he said the question reminded him of the question that Jesus was asked about healing on the Sabbath, and that there were lots of other things in the world we needed to deal with, and when they were all dealt with, we could talk about that question. So a very creative way of not answering the question.
Okay. Let's see. Here we'll mix it up a little bit. This is Romero.
So someone says that Bishop Romero will be canonized on October 14th. Romero's homily on March 23rd, 1980 called on soldiers, National Guardsmen, and police. When you hear an order from man to kill, you might obey God's law, thou shalt not kill. Will Pope Francis highlight Bishop Romero's call to end the just war theory? I don't know. I don't know Romero's life that well, but I don't know if we could say he called for the end of the just war theory. I think he was working in a very specific context. I don't know if he ever made that the overarching decision to do that. I do think that the canonization of Romero is obviously symbolically huge and very important. The choice of who is canonized, although it's not meant to be that, becomes somewhat of a model, especially in canonizing a bishop, a model for what a bishop should act like. And I think in choosing to canonize Romero, the Pope is making a statement about how a bishop should be and what a bishop could have to sacrifice. And I think for Salvadorans it means a lot more, many more things. But I think for me, that's the primary message that the Pope is sending about what it means to be a bishop and what you're called to do to the utmost.
Josh, this is a question about any more details that you might have about the recent change on the death penalty and what that might portend for the future.
I think the Pope has now fairly spoken definitively on the subject, that the Catholic Church no longer supports use of the death penalty in any context. And I think that's a major development. And he put it in the catechism, so that's now the teaching of the Church. I don't know that he'll be involved. I don't know, in the past, popes have written to individual U.S. governors to call for clemency or pardon of bishops on death row. I think the Pope has done that in a limited number of circumstances. I don't know if he's still doing that. But I think it makes it difficult for a politician who is Catholic to say that they don't want to follow church teaching. And I think anyone who wants to follow church teaching, that's what it is now. Process?
Yeah, like.
Maybe repeat what he said.
He's asking what the process on the change was. I think it's been coming for decades. I don't think it was just Pope Francis. John Paul II had changed the catechism, or in the original catechism, to say that it was only illicit in circumstances where the prisoner could not be held safely. I think, and the Pope has been telegraphing for a while that he doesn't think there's that many circumstances like that left. That there are now opportunities to hold prisoners safely, to protect the community from harm. And so there's the commandment to not kill at that point is more important.
Josh, we have a few questions about, obviously, the sex abuse scandal and some of the opposition that's been arising, very open opposition to Francis, particularly in light of the Vigano statement. And both a question of, can you talk a little bit about this opposition, like about Vigano and the others, and how can he, how his response to that, and also, how personally, I mean, you are around him personally, how do you think can you speak to how he's responding himself? So, yeah, we're gonna leave, we'll do that piece.
How he's responding? Okay. So everyone knows when we're speaking about the Vigano letter, what we're speaking about. Do I need to?
No, say it.
So Archbishop Carlo Vigano was the ambassador from the Vatican to the U.S. Until 2012, or no, beyond that, 2013, I think? I don't know. He's an Italian archbishop. 15? Yeah. He's an Italian archbishop, and on the second day of the Pope's trip to Ireland, where the Pope was doing his best to have a good trip abroad, to focus on specific subjects, and actually to speak about clergy sexual abuse because of what has happened in Ireland and the revelations in the 90s and the 2000s about the abuse that had taken place across the country. Early in the morning on that Sunday, I think it was 3 or 4 a.m., Vigano released an 11-page document alleging a widespread cover-up throughout the church to protect Cardinal McCarrick, and he alleged two major things. The first was that Pope Benedict had put sanctions on Cardinal McCarrick sometime around 2009, 2010, asking him not to be in public ministry. And the second was that Vigano himself had informed Francis about this in 2013 in a personal meeting, and that the Pope had somehow removed these sanctions. But this document that's 11 pages long, named, 24 cardinals, archbishops, Vatican officials, released at 3 a.m. during a papal trip. It was also laced with a lot of weird ideological claims about there being a pro-gay, they used the word homosexualist agenda in the church, which was just a bit strange. And it wasn't sure immediately what to take from this and to know how much of this might be true, what facts there might be, and what might be just kind of an ideological warfare. So immediately, we knew the Pope was going to be asked about it in the traditional press conference on the way home from Ireland. So coming home from Ireland, it was up to, we asked questions in terms of language groups. So the English language group decided we were going to ask the question, because it's always the English speakers who ask about clergy sexual abuse, and we have a great reputation about that. But we asked him if the two major claims were true, if there had been sanctions on Benedict had imposed on McCarrick, and if Francis knew. And Francis, having just gone, several 100-mile journey from Dublin to Knock, and then back to Dublin, and then have Mass with 100,000 people in Dublin, very wisely, I think, decided not to engage. because I don't know if he had read the document, and I don't know what he knew about it or what he knew was true or not. And he said that he would let the document speak for itself, and that it was up for us journalists to respond, to look into it, and to know, to kind of do an investigation about what was true and what wasn't. And not because he told us to, but we did what he asked. And we've learned a lot about the document. The first being that it was released by several right-wing media outlets, National Catholic Register, LifeSite News, with the help of a lawyer named Timothy Bush, a fairly right-wing figure who founded the Napa Institute. That several right-wing figures in Italy were involved, Italian journalists. And that's not to say that that makes the document invalid. It just raises a lot of questions about what the emphasis was. And I have a lot of questions about it. I don't know where it's going. My major question is why Vigano is coming forward now. If he knew about this since 2013 and there had been these questions, why hadn't he come public beforehand? I also wonder about the focus it's taking away from the clergy abuse victims. It's shifted focus from the Pennsylvania grand jury report, from the people harmed by McCarrick, to much more ideological issues about whether the Pope is going to resign or whether others might resign. I don't know at this point. I don't think the Pope is going to respond personally. I think there's just a dynamic of not wanting to kind of let the Pope get down into that muck, especially when it's not just a factual issue, but it's very ideological. But there has been a rumor that the Vatican will respond in a more bureaucratic way with some sort of document, probably from the Secretary of State. And so we're waiting to hear whether that's coming or not. The main claim that there were some sort of sanctions on McCarrick has been pretty disproven. It appears that it's possible that Benedict said something to McCarrick, but not formally, more something like to keep a low profile, but that obviously McCarrick didn't follow that at all. I mean, if he was told this in 2009, 2010, he was traveling around the world, he was in Rome, I've seen him, I've interviewed him. So the idea that he was obeying some sort of sanctions or order to keep a low profile to me is unintelligible, just because based on the evidence. So I don't know. That's about the most I can say, I think. So I think we're waiting for more from the Vatican.
Well, speaking of this, so how does that connect with Francis's? It seems like Francis is both. He's a Jesuit, so I'm curious if you have some insight about how maybe his training as a Jesuit, his formation as a Jesuit, might be informing some of his response, and the fact that he's also stated that he wants to be bold. But are those connected? Are they? How does that feed into his response? And also, Josh, just to back up a bit on the sexual abuse stuff, you were on the plane, I think, in Chile. Could you speak to that experience, being on the plane, and what happened with the Chilean bishops?
The trip to Chile was very difficult. One of the most difficult moments in my career, actually. So the Pope went to Chile and Peru in January, and he was under scrutiny there for a bishop he had appointed in 2015, who abuse survivors have said was present as a priest in the late 80s, early 90s to witness another priest abusing them. And Francis had been very insistent that he wasn't going to remove this bishop, that he knew him, that he was innocent, that it was slander being said against him. And so already the scene was set for a very contentious visit. And then when he was in the country, the Pope, quite oddly, was confronted by journalists in the country, which doesn't normally happen because he's so busy and there's such a bubble around him that there's not time. But there was an event, I can't remember where a journalist, a Chilean journalist, was able to kind of scream a question at him. And he said the claims against this bishop named Barros were slander and calumny. And obviously that doesn't go well for abuse victims when you call them liars. So it was very difficult. And on the plane home, we asked the Pope 3 times the same question, 3 different people. The basic question was, why are you believing the bishop and not the victims? And he didn't have an answer each time, and it was very difficult. The second time was the most difficult. It was a Chilean woman working for CNN Chile who was Catholic, and her voice was shaking. I mean, she could not understand how the Pope was responding, and as a Catholic, how she had to ask this question to the leader of the church: why are you believing a bishop and not the victims? So it looked very bad. But to his credit, when the Pope came home about a week later, he announced that he was sending Archbishop Scicluna, a Maltese archbishop who had been the promoter of justice at the Vatican, the prosecutor, to Chile to write a report, to meet with people. He came back, wrote, I can't remember, I think it's a 200-some page report. The Pope wrote a letter to the people of Chile apologizing, saying he had done wrong, and then calling the bishops to Rome, all of the Chilean bishops, for a meeting. That meeting happened. A few hours later we learned that it's not clear if they had been requested or if it had been offered, but all of the bishops of Chile offered their resignations to the Pope, and so far the Pope has accepted 5. So we're not sure if more are coming. It's a difficult situation, and I think some people are calling for the U.S. bishops to do the same, to offer their, all en masse, to offer their resignations. I have to say, I have critique on that. I don't know if it's the best way forward. Doing that is an extraordinary step, and it is to say, basically the responsibility is not ours anymore, and we're stepping aside. And there's 34 bishops in Chile who did it, and that means the Pope has to decide one by one who goes, who stays, and who replaces them. And he's running out of people to put in their place. So each of, I think there's 4 auxiliary bishops in the capital. Each of them now is an apostolic administrator of another diocese, which means he's going to have to start calling up priests who he doesn't know, or he's just relying on information about quickly to put them in place. To me, I don't know if the Chilean example is a direct parallel to what's going on in the U.S. If every U.S. bishop, to me, put out their resignation, it would be a basic, it would be saying, this is no longer my responsibility, it's yours, Pope. You figure out what to do, you figure out whether I stay or go, you figure out how to handle things, and I'm just going to go away. And I don't know if that's the best way forward, or if that's fair to the Pope or to people here. So I would wonder about that, and I would wonder if it would be better to have a strategic inquiry of which bishops need to go. I see a hand there, yeah.
If the Pope doesn't do it, who can? We as lay people don't stand a chance. And you want the bishops to judge the bishops, and, I mean, who's going to do it? We've got states attorneys general investigating. So whose role is it?
I wrote an article some months ago. I think what's, yeah, okay. The question is, who's going to do it if the bishops don't? Should bishops be investigating bishops? And it's up to the lay people. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, but we have no authority to do it.
Yeah.
Josh, in response to her question, the Pope in June of 2016 issued a motu proprio changing canon law regarding what he called it as a loving mother, or like a loving mother. And what that did was to set up a process for evaluating bishops. Were they negligent in handling their duty to protect children and vulnerable adults? Now, I read that carefully. I'm a lawyer, and I was looking at it, and I'm saying, this is a marvelous opportunity for the people, because it doesn't say who can compile. I mean, it's work, but it doesn't prevent people in a diocese, for example, if they see something that is, the bishop is not following through on his duty, that they can't put together a report and submit it to the bishop office in the Vatican. I mean, as a practical matter, they would probably talk to the bishop first, but there's nothing in there that prevents the people from acting. And have you heard anything about that kind of thing being done? I mean, it's hard because it takes work, but there's nothing in there that prevents us from acting. Just people.
I mean, the first thing I would say is, if you know something, don't go to the church, go to civil authorities, go to the police. The second thing is that motu proprio, basically what it did is it empowered 4 Vatican offices, each which would oversee bishops for certain reasons, to create tribunals, to basically judge bishops but it has more to do with whether or not bishops were appropriately handling clergy. So if a priest did something, did they take care of it? Did they report them to authorities? Did they remove them from ministry? It's not clear to me that the motu proprio is being followed by the letter of it. It seems the Pope is instead putting in place case-by-case tribunals. That's what he told us on the plane back from Ireland. And he gave a couple examples. But the key problem for me is transparency. We don't know what's going on. We don't know what bishops are being accused or being tried or what is happening. And so I think the idea for the accountability tribunal is still one that was approved by the Pope, but it wasn't put in place. The idea that there should be one tribunal in Rome specifically tasked with receiving allegations that a bishop did not handle the clergy appropriately, mishandled an abuse allegation, and basically begin the procedure for whether or not they're guilty or not.
So, I know you said that one of the challenges lack of transparency. But this is a question asking if you have any sense, is Francis looking at this crisis as a way to meaningfully change the church governance? That is, give women equal say and more power to women and lay people, and recognizing more communities, the LGBTQ community, and more women's rights. And is any sense that he's responding in that way? I'm just reading what the question is.
I don't know if he's responding specifically in that way. I think the idea to call the heads of the bishops' conferences to Rome, I think, is an interesting point, and it goes a bit to what you asked about him being a Jesuit. I think it puts an emphasis on the fact that there's a locality to the crisis, a localness to it, that Rome hasn't really recognized, at least outside the U.S. Church up till now. And so the Pope he loves this phrase of going to the peripheries and going to places that, ordinary people don't think of or don't go to. But what he's doing here is calling the peripheries to Rome so he can give them marching orders and then ordering them back to the peripheries to follow them. It's an interesting inversion of kind of how he normally acts in terms of wanting to go to the peripheries and bring something there. But I think that the change might be in, for years the local bishops' conference was not really respected by Rome. There was a document in the mid-'80s that really stripped it of a lot of its power. And perhaps now the Pope is saying we need to reactivate the bishops' conferences. They're the ones who know most. Not to say that there won't be times to come to Rome for a definitive judgment or whatnot, but that there might be a time to have local bishops' conferences handle matters.
Thank you. We're just going to shift topics just for a bit and ask about when you're talking about the turning the pyramid upside down. Can you give a few more examples of the faithful leading? And then secondly, second part of that is the family life process seems to have fallen short on LGBT issues. That he has given, Francis's words have given the impression that he believes they are all equal before God, but they're not allowed a full life, including love and romantic relationships. So, do you have any insight on that? And should we expect or look for any changes for the treatment of LGBTQ people in the church?
So for the first question, the pyramid and more lay involvement. I think there's a number of examples. For some reason, what's coming to mind is when the Pope, I think in 2016, went to the Greek island of Lesbos, where there was in the midst of the worst migration crisis in history, the Pope wanted to go see the refugee camps and be with the migrants and be with them. And he invited Patriarch Bartholomew to come with him. It was a beautiful moment. It was a quick, it was planned within a week or something. It was ridiculous. We didn't know it was coming, and all of a sudden we were going. But the way home, we were on the plane coming back, and they started telling, and they hadn't told us, and all of a sudden they told us, oh, by the way, there's 12 refugee families on the plane. The Pope is taking them home. It was a really marvelous, unexpected thing. It was an image of what he was calling on others to do, which is to welcome the stranger. And the reason I say it involves lay people is that it was an initiative that the Pope had cooked up with the Sant'Egidio community, which is an Italian lay community, and they took the refugees in. They figured out the visas with Italy. It was all done beforehand. And then they got them set up in Italian language schools so that they would be immediately integrated into society. So I think there's a bit of, I don't know, that's not so much the lay leadership leading, but it's hand in hand. And that the Pope is really looking for ways that everyone can be involved to do the Church's mission.
So Josh, there are many more really important questions going in different directions, but I want to take you back to the question that Richard Urban asked a while ago about the follow-up to the 2016 conference that Pax Christi International and the Vatican co-sponsored, because there has been a lot of ongoing work related to that. We do think that we will have another conference after the first of the year that the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, we expect will co-sponsor. We're still walking down that road a bit. But my question, actually, that's a very practical one, is the impression that we have in dealing pretty directly with the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development is that there is no way on planet Earth that one office of any number of people could possibly manage what has been given to that dicastery to manage, whether it is global finance, immigration, climate change, peace, war, it's poverty, it's pretty spectacular. So my question is a really practical one. From your observation, how do you continue, what is the success rate of this new structure that Pope Francis has put together, and what is its intention? Because our intention as Pax Christi International is to absolutely continue the conversation, and we have been in a process of global roundtables, preparing for that. We've had ongoing dialogue with the dicastery, but it does feel like, well, this week it's climate change, and next week it's a new statement on finance, and next week it's immigration, and next week it's poverty. So it feels like a very difficult structure to work at compared with what we dealt with 2 years ago. So anything you can say that can help us figure this out would be very welcome.
It's all about the indefatigable Cardinal Turkson.
Yeah, no kidding.
I don't know. I think there was a call for basically consolidation, that there had been like 4 or 5 different offices that they wanted to put into one structure. And I think the idea was to have Cardinal Turkson at the top of it, and then to have kind of substructures underneath him for different areas, different subject areas. I think on some issues they're doing well. The follow-up on the climate change encyclical, they've been really dedicated. They had a conference a couple weeks ago on the 3rd anniversary of Laudato Si, and they brought in an incredible spate of speakers, and it was also action-oriented. They wanted to know what to do going forward, and there was a sharing component. It was interesting, which I can't say for every Vatican conference. I don't know who they're bringing in to help, and I don't know what... There's also a hiring freeze at the Vatican, which is limiting them in terms of who they can hire and how many staff to have. I think the retirement of Flaminia will be a real loss. She's an incredible person. She's been in Vatican service, I think, since 1973. It's around that time. She was the first woman to be an undersecretary. So I don't know how they're planning to work with that. There's a new priest there, an Argentinian who is, who's working most, Augusto Zampini, who is working most with the climate change issue. He's very energetic, and being Argentinian, he has this habit of being able to talk to the Pope. I don't know how that works. So I don't really know. I think that there's a lot on their plate. I think both Turkson and Farrell, with the Laity Family Life Office, have a lot to do. And a lot of it doesn't get noted because there's so many other issues with the Vatican that people have. So I don't know where it goes.
Okay, we're going to ask about that a female theologian recently has said that she believes that we could have a schism unless the system reforms clericalism and becomes more transparent. So, any thoughts on that? And also, just related is the Pope's plans for the increased role for women. I know he did double the number of women, that's right. But any more to say about the senior role for women in the church? And what does a timeline for these changes look like? And I know that there has been talk about the possibility of women cardinals. Any thoughts on that?
My vote's with Marie. I don't think, yeah. I think the major thing, one opening, well, the one opening is the Deacons Commission. What are they going to decide? And what, essentially, if they recommend something to the Pope, what will he do with it and what will he decide to do? I think the second change we haven't seen, but I think would be fairly easy to do, would be make women members of the Synod of Bishops. And so the Synod of Bishops is this global meeting, and they come to Rome, but at the moment it's only men who are members. Women attend as auditors or as experts. And so they're present for the whole time, they take part in the small group sessions, they give their input, but at the end of the day they can't vote on the document. And so I'm wondering, for a while, for years, the reason they were saying that was the case was because you had to be ordained to be a member of the Synod, because it is a Synod of Bishops, and I understand the theology behind that. But at the last Synod in 2015, I think by accident, they let in a brother.
It was a Maryknoll brother, I believe.
Was he Maryknoll? I don't. No, it was a French. It was a French
okay.
order. I think because there was a. Honestly, I'm not joking. I think it's because there was a translation issue, and I think in French, brother is FR or PR or something. And there was, anyways. But the point of the matter is that there has now been a non-ordained member of the Synod of Bishops. So I wonder if that's something that could be followed up on. It wasn't followed up on this time. But they did appoint 2 new brothers to this synod. So they're sticking with the brother thing. And I think part of that is that there are 2 umbrella groups of religious in Rome. So the International Union of Superiors General there's a male and a men's and a women's. And the men's group has been very good about promoting the work of the women's group. And I think there might be a strategy here of the men putting forward brothers to subtly make the point, well, sisters could work too. So I just don't know where that's going.
Just back to the sexual abuse crisis, one more question. Is there any chance the U.S. bishops would lobby in all 50 states to extend the statute of limitation for child abuse?
I don't know. I think that's something certainly to call for. We at NCR have made a bunch of calls in our editorials. One is for ending statutes of limitations. Other is for getting rid of all confidentiality agreements with survivors. So if they want to come forward, they can. They don't have to, but in the McCarrick case, for example, we know that there were 2 confidentiality agreements where these survivors had agreed to be quiet and receive money. And Cardinal Tobin, when the recent allegation came forward, released the survivors from that agreement. And part of what we know about McCarrick, how he acted, was because one of the survivors then chose to come forward. So I think those are 2 issues, certainly. And the bishops' meeting is coming up in November. It'll be in Baltimore. And so it's quite close to here.
Josh, one more question about do you have any comment on the connection between on life issues, the broad life issues, the protection of life at all stages, all the way through war and death penalty, and because it does seem like there is often a disconnect in the connection between all the life issues. Do you have any comment on that?
I think the Pope has been quite clear about Catholic teaching on life. The change to the Catechism on death penalty makes that clear. He's been very outspoken against arms trafficking, gun trafficking. And he was just in Palermo, Sicily yesterday, And he said you cannot be a mafioso and Catholic, and you can't look the other way. So he's been quite clear. The question of whether just war teaching itself as a paradigm changes, I don't know. I think that's still developing, but otherwise I think he's been quite clear.
Can you share a particularly funny episode with Pope Francis? that you could share. You think on that, and in the meantime, here's one. You know Pax Christi. You were a Pax Christi member when you were a young person. You have observed some of the work that we've been doing. Can you speak to the role of Pax Christi, both of the International Secretariat and the Pax Christi sections, in moving the church along?
Well, I'm going to lose all my journalistic objectivity here. I think Pax Christi is very important. It's obviously dear to my heart. It was something I got involved in at Catholic U and was very important to me in my life, along with I see Kathy Boylan, and the DC Catholic Worker was very important to me as well, in shaping who I became and what I was interested in the church. And I think we're seeing Pax Christi play a role we haven't seen it play in this papacy in a long time, with the attention that the Pope Francis is giving to it, that the Cardinal Turkson's dicastery, that others in the Vatican are giving. The Just War Conference really attracted worldwide attention. The fact that the Vatican was considering this issue in a new way, bringing people to Rome, hearing not only from academics, but from practitioners of nonviolence in the field, Afghanistan, Pakistan, I think you had from all over the world. One thing I think, I mentioned this in the car the other night, the Pope just announced he's going to Japan next year, and I know Pax Christi is going to have its big meeting in 2 years, but if the Pope goes to Hiroshima and says something about nuclear weapons, maybe I think Marie Dennis should be there.
Yeah.